In the summer of 1893, something happened on the southern shore of Lake Superior that nobody in Marquette, Michigan was prepared for. The water dropped. Not slowly, the way a lake retreats in a dry summer. It dropped 11 feet in what witnesses described as a matter of days. And when it did, the lake bed it exposed wasn't sand, it wasn't silt. It wasn't the jagged bedrock you'd expect from one of the oldest geological formations on the planet. It was a pier, a carved, fitted, structured pier, stretching out beneath the surface of a lake that was supposed to be ancient, undisturbed, and wild. And then, 48 hours later, the Army Corps of Engineers showed up and put the water back. That's the story. That's the part history doesn't want to linger on, because if you pull that thread, if you follow what that pier implies, where it leads, what it would have required to build, and why an arm of the United States military responded with such extraordinary speed, you end up somewhere that rewrites everything you were told about this continent. Let's go back to 1893. The World's Columbian Exposition was running in Chicago. America was celebrating what it called 400 years of civilization in the Western Hemisphere. Columbus, progress, manifest destiny, the whole mythology. And up on the shores of Lake Superior, in a small iron mining city called Marquette, the lake started doing something that had no place in that mythology at all. Lake Superior is the largest freshwater lake on Earth by surface area. It holds 10% of the world's surface fresh water. It is not a river that floods and recedes on a schedule. Even the most dramatic storm-induced seiches, those wind-driven oscillations that push water from one end of the lake to the other, have historically measured in the range of 1 to 3 feet along the southern shore, not 11. Not by any natural mechanism that mainstream geology has ever produced in the documented record. But 11 feet is what the historical accounts describe. And what those 11 feet revealed was not supposed to be there. The pier that emerged from the receding water was described by witnesses as cut stone, fitted, dressed, not random boulders pushed together by glacial action, not a natural reef, cut stone placed with intention, forming a structure that extended from the Marquette shoreline into the lake. People walked out on it, they examined it, they talked about it, and then the water came back. The Army Corps was credited with the refilling, and the official record went very quiet, because the question isn't just, what was the pier? It's what does the existence of that pier demand we accept about the history of this region? And once you accept what it demands, one follow-up question becomes inevitable. Why did the government move so fast to cover it back up? The official history of the Great Lakes region goes like this. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. 10,000 years ago, the last glaciers retreated. The lake basins filled. Indigenous peoples arrived and thrived for millennia. European explorers showed up in the 1600s. Fur traders, missionaries, then settlers. Marquette itself was founded in 1849, incorporated as a city in 1871. Nowhere in that timeline is there room for a carved stone pier at the bottom of Lake Superior. Nowhere in the archaeological consensus, nowhere in the geological record as it's been officially presented, is there a civilization that could have built it. And that's exactly the problem. The Tartarian framework, the body of research and historical reassessment that's been growing for the last decade and a half, proposes something the official timeline cannot accommodate. There was a civilization here before, not a primitive one, not a pre-agricultural band of nomads slowly developing tools, a sophisticated, architecturally advanced civilization that built in stone, built at scale, built structures meant to last, across a geography that included the shores of the Great Lakes. The word Tartaria comes from old maps. European cartography from the 1500s through the 1700s shows a territory labelled Tartaria, or Tartary, covering an enormous swath of the Eurasian continent and sometimes extending into regions of North America, supposedly unknown to Europeans at the time. The people attributed to this territory on those maps are described as builders, as civilization, not as savages, not as wilderness, as a functioning society with infrastructure. And then, across a remarkable range of historical sources, that civilization disappears, not gradually, not through the slow attrition of conquest and assimilation. It disappears in a way that looks like a reset. Like someone turned a page and started a new chapter and burned the old one. The 1,893 Marquette Pier fits into that framework with an uncomfortable precision. To build a fitted stone pier into Lake Superior, you need quarried stone, transport, engineering, and labor at scale. You need people who understood load-bearing structures, who knew how to build something that would survive the freeze-thaw cycles of a Lake Superior winter, the ice pressure, the wave action, centuries of submersion. This is not primitive technology. This is not a hunting camp. This is infrastructure. And infrastructure implies a city. A city implies a population. A population implies supply chains, governance, communication networks, and a relationship with this landscape that lasted long enough to leave stone in the lake bed. Where is the record of that city? The mainstream answer is that it doesn't exist because the city never existed. The pier was probably a natural formation misidentified by excited witnesses. The water drop was probably exaggerated in the retelling. The Army Corps story is probably a mundane harbour engineering project that got tangled up with the unusual water conditions through rumour and oral history. That's the official out. And it's worth examining why it's so readily accepted. Because natural rock formations don't get described as fitted and carved by multiple independent witnesses. Seiches don't drop lake levels by 11 feet. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now. Because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. And the Army Corps of Engineers doesn't show up within 48 hours to flood something unless there is something specific being flooded. That last point is the one that cuts deepest. 48 hours. Think about what that implies in 1893. There is no internet, there is no helicopter. Moving heavy equipment to a remote location on the shore of Lake Superior takes planning. It takes prior knowledge of what might be there. Or it takes a standing protocol for exactly this kind of situation. The people who have researched this event most carefully point to a pattern that appears repeatedly in the late 19th and early 20th century record. Anomalous structures get discovered. Witnesses describe them. Local newspapers sometimes run brief accounts. And then something happens to close the loop. Federal involvement, private acquisition, flooding, reburial. The Smithsonian receives the artifacts and they disappear into storage. The land gets fenced off. This pattern has a name in the Tartarian research community. It gets called the cover-up cycle. And the Marquette Pier event of 1,893 fits the cycle almost point for point. Discovery, public witness, brief documentation, rapid government response, concealment. The official history of this continent serves a specific ideological purpose. It positions European settlement as the arrival of civilization in a land that was either empty or only lightly occupied. It frames the United States as the inheritor of a tradition transplanted from the Old World and locates the roots of American cities and infrastructure in the 19th century in the hands of the people writing the history. If there was a prior civilization here that built stone piers and stone cities and stone everything else, then the land wasn't empty. The structures that dot the American landscape, the ones that look suspiciously old for their supposed 19th century origin dates, may not have been built when the official record says they were. And the entire mythology of manifest destiny, the entire justification for westward expansion, comes apart at the seams. So you hide the pier, you bring in the Army Corps, you put the water back, you let the newspaper account fade. You do not commission a geological survey. You flood it and you move on and hope that nobody connects the dots. Marquette was at the center of the American iron economy in 1893. The Army Corps had been improving that harbor for years. Loading docks, breakwaters, dock construction. There was already a working relationship between the federal government and the Marquette waterfront. That relationship made it easy to dispatch equipment on short notice and fold an unusual operation into the noise of routine harbor work. Who's going to look closely at an Army Corps project on a harbor the Army Corps is already managing? This is how the cover-up cycle works in practice. It doesn't require a secret society in a candlelit room. It requires people in authority making practical decisions about what is inconvenient to acknowledge. The Army Corps officer who gets the call doesn't need a memo titled "Suppress Evidence of Prior Civilization." He needs to be told there's a situation at the Marquette Harbor requiring immediate, discreet attention. The rest takes care of itself. Now the geological question, because it's the one skeptics lean on hardest. The argument goes that Lake Superior's water levels are controlled by such massive hydrological forces that an 11-foot drop in a localized area is physically impossible. The drainage basin covers almost 125,000 square miles. The St. Mary's River is the only outlet. Year-to-year variations have historically been measured in inches to a couple of feet over multi-year cycles, not days. This is all true for the lake as a whole. But a seiche, a standing wave caused by sustained wind pressure, can pile water toward one shore and pull it dramatically from the other. The most extreme documented seiche events on Lake Superior have approached 4 or 5 feet in affected locations. Nothing close to 11, which is exactly what makes the 1,893 Marquette account so difficult to explain within normal parameters. Either the event was exaggerated, or it was a seiche with no documented parallel in the lake's history, or something else caused it entirely. The Tartarian research framework includes a body of work on what some researchers call mudfloods and cataclysm events. The prior civilization wasn't simply forgotten. It was ended, violently, rapidly, and on a continental or global scale. Water moved to places it hadn't been. Their cities were buried under sediment, later misattributed to slow geological processes. Within that framework, the water behavior at Marquette in 1893 takes on a different character, possibly a residual instability, a pocket of geological memory from a much larger event, lasting just long enough for the stone beneath to become visible, and for the Army Corps to come and put it back where nobody could see it. The pier that was exposed wasn't described as half-buried or partially eroded. It was described as intact, recognizable, something that people could walk out on and examine as a coherent structure. Stone submerged in cold, clear, fresh water doesn't rot. If the prior civilization ended somewhere in the range of 200 to 500 years before the 19th century, you'd be looking at a structure submerged for centuries when the 1,893 witnesses walked out on it. Entirely survivable. And it would fit within the gap in the official timeline, the gap where the history books say there was nothing going on here. The gap that's actually filled, if you look at the anomalies, with the ruins of something that was already old when Columbus set sail. Marquette, in 1893, is not an isolated case. In 1838, workers digging in Cincinnati found finished stone walls at 90 feet depth. The official explanation settled on pre-Columbian construction, but the sophistication raised questions that were never fully answered. The site was built over. In 1879, a farmer in Ohio uncovered what witnesses described as a stone city beneath his field. Federal officials visited, the artifacts were taken, and the site was subsequently declared a natural formation. In 1912, underwater divers in Lake Michigan reported stone columns in water too deep and cold for any 19th century construction technology. No follow-up was ever commissioned. The pattern repeats across this continent with a regularity that stops feeling coincidental around the 20th example. And the Marquette Pier is one of the clearest, because the response, the Army Corps flooding the site within 48 hours, is too fast, too specific, and too well coordinated to be accidental bureaucratic efficiency. You don't accidentally respond that fast to a geological curiosity. You respond that fast to something that's been flagged. something where the protocol is already in place before the water starts to drop. It implies that somewhere in the institutional memory of the United States government in 1893, there is awareness that things like this can happen, that the water can recede and show you something you're not supposed to see, and that when it does, there is a procedure, not improvised. A procedure. One that existed because situations like the Marquette Pier had happened before, and the people managing the official history of this continent had learned that when the ground tells a different story, the ground needs to be covered back up. The 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago, running simultaneously with the Marquette event, presented a vision of American civilization tracing its lineage to ancient Greece and Rome. Neoclassical columns, grand facades, a civilization announcing its legitimacy through connection to the classical past. And 500 miles north, at the bottom of a lake that dropped 11 feet, there was a stone pier that nobody at the exposition was going to be allowed to examine. History is not just what happened, it's what gets recorded, what gets preserved, what gets taught, and what gets flooded. The Lake Superior Pier of 1893 sits at the intersection of all four. Something happened. It was witnessed. It was documented, however briefly, and then it was covered up with a speed that tells you more about the importance of what was found than any surviving photograph ever could. The water came back up. The pier went back under. The official record moved on. And in Marquette, a story passed between people who were there, people who walked out on stone that wasn't supposed to exist, until eventually those people were gone too, and the story passed into the margins where it has lived ever since. But the stone is still down there. The pier is still down there. Lake Superior is cold and clear and patient, and the water can always drop again. The question is whether anyone will be allowed to look the next time it does.